What are the true origins of the Rip Van Winkle story? And what is the holiday of Purim that Jews just celebrated around the world teach us about the coronavirus? This is Rabbi Yossi Madvig, and you're listening to Jews Did It First. All right, well, I'm glad you're listening, and please subscribe, leave a review, and if you'd like to contribute to help keep the podcast going, please go to jewishiswego.org/Jews Did It First. Hit the Make a Donation button at the top. I really appreciate that. Makes it easier for me to keep these coming out to you because it does take some time and effort and energy and all that sort of thing. So anyway, on to our program. So I've been thinking of doing this one for a while. I just never got to it. For some reason, I just felt inspired to do it. And that is the story of Rip Van Winkle. Now, you may know the gist of the story, right? Guy falls asleep for a while and wakes up. That's basically what most people know about the story. But actually, it's actually quite an involved story. The short of it is Rip Van Winkle is a short story written by an American named Washington Irving. It was published in 1819. So that's quite a while ago, 200 years ago. And the main plot is that this takes place before the Revolutionary War in America. And there's this guy, he goes, Van Winkle. He's a Dutch-American villager. And he's in the Catskills. And he goes up to get away from his nagging wife, and he hears this loud noise. He hears people, all this crashing going on, and he sees this very nicely dressed group of bearded men who are playing bowling. They're like a 9-pin bowling. I don't really know what game this is, but I'm sure it's a thing. And he hangs out with them, and they have this interesting, intoxicating beverage, and he drinks some of it, and eventually he falls asleep. And he has no idea while he's asleep, the entire Revolutionary War happens, and he wakes up 20 years later, and people are asking him, oh, who'd you vote for, election, whatever. He's like, election? What are you talking about? I'm a subject of King George III, and they string him up as some kind of counter-revolutionary guy, and they're about to execute him until finally some old lady realizes, hey, I know this guy. He's, he must have, he doesn't know what's going on. He's been missing for 20 years. He probably just doesn't know. And he finds out that his wife has passed. His children are all grown up. His daughter takes him in and helps him out. And that's sort of the main gist of the story. And basically, where this story comes from is quite intriguing. There are a lot of prior versions to this, and I'll try and take us back in history, sort of, going, from the most recent to the most distant. And actually, there's some modern versions of this, by the way, that if you come into our present day, there's been some science fiction versions of this story where, guy wakes up and in the future, something reminded me. Oh, there used to be this movie. I think it was a '90s movie called Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone and Wesley Snipes, I think. And it's kind of that similar story of he was cryo freeze, whatever. He was frozen as some punishment, and he's brought back. I think it's like 50 years later or something like that. 20 years later, 50 years later, whatever it is, and to catch this criminal. So you see this concept even nowadays in modern science fiction. So let's take a trip back in history. If we go a couple hundred years ago, around 1800, you have a story that is widely thought to be the basis of Rip Van Winkle itself, and that is Johann, if I would say it correctly, Carl Christoph Nachtigall.
He is the author of a shorter story called Peter Klaus. And this is pretty much the basic Rip Van Winkle story. It's in a German village instead of, in the American colonies before the Revolutionary War. It's in a German village, and this goat herder named Peter Klaus, he goes looking for a lost goat, and he finds some guys drinking in the woods, very similar, again, to Rip Van Winkle there. And after drinking some of their schnapps over there, or wine, or whatever it was, he falls asleep and he wakes back up. And again, 20 years have passed, right? Very similar. And that's pretty much taken as, oh, this seems to be like where Washington Irving got his idea for Van Winkle. Okay, so there is sort of the most contemporary point of the Rip Van Winkle story. And then if you go back a couple hundred years, that was around the turn of the 19th century. You go back to the turn of the go to the 17th century, and there you've got a story of the Orkney Islands around in Scotland, some Scottish isles, and it's near, I believe it's near Stonehenge, actually. It's where it's supposed to take place. And you have these trolls that, this drunken fiddler finds his way into, he hears this music and he finds some trolls, like they call them trowels or something like this. And they're basically trolls. And they're having a party. He stays and he plays fiddle for these trolls for a couple of hours, but when he gets home, it turns out 50 years have passed. So he doesn't fall asleep or anything, and it's longer, it's 50 years, but you have the same basic idea. And again, many people feel that this is one of the sources of the Rip Van Winkle story. And as an interesting side note in history, Washington Irving, who was the author of the original story, it turns out that his family, his father's side of the family, in fact, I think it was his father himself, was from these islands, from these Orkney Islands. So he would be called an Orcadian, as they might say. And he was from the island of Chappensay. And so he probably knew this story, and my guess is he told his son this story, Washington Irving, and then Washington Irving writes this story. So we have two stories that probably fed into Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle story that are located within a couple hundred years of him writing it. But if you go back even further, somewhere between the 10th and 12th century, there is another basic plot that strongly resembles the Rip Van Winkle story, and that is actually a story of the Seneca tribe of Native Americans. There's some legend of a young squirrel hunter, and he encounters these mystical little people, and after he spends a night with them, he returns to find out that an entire year has passed and his village is now overgrown with foliage, and everyone's gone because a whole year has passed. So there's this old, dare I say, Indian folktale, Native American folktale that seems to. I tried searching for an original telling of this story, but I couldn't find one. But if this guy is writing in the New York area, it turns out apparently that Washington Irving has never actually been upstate. This takes place in the Catskills. So it would make sense that it could be based on a Seneca legend, but it doesn't seem like he had too much interaction with them, so it's unlikely. But nevertheless, that is a prior version of a similar story. But if we go back even further, we have 7th century Christian story, which apparently is also mentioned in Islam. So the Christian story, there's a Christian story which is probably around the 5th century, and then it's mentioned in Islam in the 7th century. And there's a group of young people who believe in God, and they're escaping persecution. They run into a cave, and they come out, and it's hundreds of years later. And in the Christian story, in the Christian story, it's called the Seven Sleepers of Ephesius. Ephesius, I believe, and that's again this group of early Christians. They go in supposedly in the middle of the 3rd century, and they come out. It's been 200 years, so that brings you to the 5th century. And they fall asleep, and this is for some reason they fall asleep 200 years later, and they find out that the entire Roman Empire has become Christian. So this story is echoed in Islam. Where is it found? The Surah of the Quran, Surah Al-Kahf. I don't really know. I'm not an Islamic expert over here, but there's a couple stories. There's this has seemed to have been appropriated by Islam, and then there's another story similar, also in Islamic tradition, of Uzair, who was very sad that God had taken his soul and brought him back to life after Jerusalem was reconstructed. He rides on his donkey, and he goes back to where he's from, but the people don't even recognize him. His household, everyone's gone except for some maid who's now some old blind woman. And he prays to God to cure her blindness and that she should see again. And he meets his son. His son does recognize him by now. And because he has some birthmark, and that's that's the story. Sort of, I'm not sure exactly how it ends, but that's the basic story, right? He goes and he's been away for so long. In this sense, he dies and then comes back. He didn't really fall asleep, so I'm not sure if the Uzair story really kind of but it has that Rip Van Winkle feel where he comes back so many years later and sees that everything's different, where for him very little time has passed. You also have in the 5th century, there's an Irish story of Niam and Ushin, I think is how it's pronounced. They this Ushin falls in love with this beautiful Niam. I'm pronouncing these things a little bit. I don't really speak Gaelic, so sorry. And he leaves with her on this horse, and they go to Tir na Nog, which is is land of the ever young, and he stays there. And eventually he wants to go back, and she gives him this horse and says, "Don't get off the horse." And because 300 years have passed, don't get off the horse. He encounters some men, and they're trying to move a boulder or whatever. He reaches down to help him, but he ends up falling off the horse. And as soon as he falls off the horse, he instantly becomes super old because 300 years have passed, and then he dies of old age. Now, this story ends with this man being brought to St. Patrick. And so we know that St. Patrick was in the 5th century, and so we know that this story is a 5th century story. But yes, of course, there's more. In the 3rd century, you have a few other versions of this story. Just to go through it really quickly, you have the lives and opinions of eminent philosophers, which is by a 3rd century Greek historian, Diogenes Laertius, and he tells a story of the sage Epimenides of Knossos. Okay, sorry, my pronunciation sucks. What are you gonna do? Anyway, he said he was a shepherd on the island of Crete, and one day this Epimenides, he's following after sheep, much reminiscent of that guy, the Klaus, Peter Klaus, who was going after a lost goat. He's going after a sheep that wandered off, and after becoming tired, he goes into a cave under Mount Ida, and he falls asleep. And when he wakes up, of course, he's looking for the sheep, but he can't find it. And so he goes back to the farm, and he finds out it's under new ownership. And he goes home, and nobody knows him. And finally, he sees his younger brother, and now his younger brother's like a really old man. It turns out that he was actually gone for 50 years. So this is very, very, very similar to that Scottish and German story, especially the Scottish one. And so it turns out he lives to be 100, and there's different stories, different versions, 150 years, 300 years. But basically, this seems to be by many people to be the earliest known variant of the Rip Van Winkle story. Although there are some other 3rd century Asian stories as well. There's a Chinese story of Ranka, and you also have there's also back into the 8th century, you have a Japanese tale called Urashima Taro, and then there's a Hindu story that also the story of Muchakunda, which I believe also was 8th century, but yeah, so the 3rd century seems to be where the trail ends, right? The 3rd century, you have Greek, you have Chinese, and these seem to be the oldest variants of the Rip Van Winkle story. But of course, we know better on this program, and we know that Jews did it first. How did Jews did it first, you ask? Well, I'm so glad you asked. I will tell you. So in Judaism, there is a story related in the Talmud of a man named Honi Hamagil. Now, Honi Hamagil, Hamagil means the circle maker, and the way he got his name, it has nothing to do with the Rip Van Winkle story, but the way Honi Hamagil got his name was because he was a very holy man, and Israel was going through a drought, and they had no rain. So this Honi Hamagil, he goes and he draws a circle in the ground, and he tells God, I'm not moving from this circle until you bring rain. And the story goes that Honi Hamagil is sitting there, and a few drops fall, not really enough to do anything. And he says, what do you mean? This isn't going to help. We need real rain. And so it starts flooding and flooding. I think there's different versions of the story. One says that he says we need less rain because this is damaging, or one says I'm not going to stop. Still not going to move until the cisterns are full. Like it's not enough just to have the rain, but it's got to keep going until we have the surplus of water that we need in order to keep things going. And sure enough, it all works out. And then he says, okay, make it stop, and the rain stops. So that's how Honi Hamagil got his name, and he lived in the 1st century BCE, not CE, not in the current area. Not in the current era, whereas the other stories were all the 3rd century of the Common Era, and this is actually the 1st century before the Common Era. He was journeying on the road, and he sees a man planting a carob tree, and he asks him, how long does it take to bear fruit? The man says 70 years. Carob trees take 70 years. So Honi Hamagil says, look, you're not going to live another 70 years. So why are you bothering? And the man says, no, that's true, but I'm planting this not for myself, but for future generations that come after me, right? And then those generations, even though I may not benefit, it's for the future. And so later that day, he sits down to rest, and it turns out that he ends up sleeping for 70 years, and these rocks form around him like a tent, which is interesting because some of these later stories all involve people going into caves. So here you have these rocks forming around him almost like a cave. And he sleeps there for 7 years. He wakes up. He sees a man picking carobs from this tree. Right, there's carobs all over it. And he says, wait a minute, you're the man that planted this tree? And the guy says, no, my father told me that his father planted this tree for me. And so we see he falls asleep, and he comes and he sees the descendants, and this is for 70 years that he fell asleep. So this is a little bit longer than the typical 20 or 50 year story, not quite as long as the 200, 300 year story that you see in the Christian and Islamic texts. But certainly this seems to be the real story of Rip Van Winkle as related in the Talmud. It is quite a story, and I highly recommend you take a look and find these. This is in the section of the Talmud of Ta'anit, of fasts. So that's what the book is called, and I believe it's on page 16, side A, and definitely take a look. Now, it's also this story can not only be found in the Babylonian Talmud, which is probably where it's most famous, but it's also found in the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, now it doesn't have the Jerusalem Talmud doesn't mention the circle drawing story, but it does mention the carob tree story, and it turns out. So he says that the oh, I'm sorry. So in the Jerusalem Talmud, it's in Taanis 3, uh, Mishnah 3:9, chapter 3, Mishnah 9. Uh, and where does it? Where in the Talmud is it? This is the question that I wanted to show you, and now I just lost the reference. 23a in the Babylonian Talmud. I said 16. My apologies. It is not 16. It's 23a, and then it's 16b in the Jerusalem Talmud. That's where I was thinking. So I apologize there. So there you go. And I'll just read you a little quick thing. It says that Choni Amagil, the grandson of Choni Amagil, so near the time of the destruction of the temple, he goes out to the mountain to his workers. Before he got there, it rained. He went to a cave and he sat down there and fell asleep. This is the Jerusalem Talmud one. It's different than the Babylonian Talmud story. So he goes and falls asleep, and he remained there for 70 years until the temple was destroyed, and it was rebuilt a second time. At the end of the 70 years, he woke up from his sleep. He went out of the cave and saw a world completely changed. An area that had been planted with vineyards was now produced olives. The area with olives now produced grain. And he asked the people, "What do you hear in the world?" They said to him, "And you don't know what the news is?" He said, "No, what's going on? Who are you?" And he says, "I'm Choni Amagil." And they said to him, "We heard that when Choni Amagil would go to the temple courtyard, it would be illuminated." So he went and illuminated the place and recited the following verse of scripture: "When the Lord restored the future of Zion, when the Lord restored the fortune of Zion, we were like those who dream." From Psalms 126. It doesn't go into as much detail as the Babylonian Talmud story does, but that's typical. The Jerusalem Talmud in general is a much more concise, a much more terse work, whereas the Babylonian Talmud is very expansive and explains a lot. So there you have it. When it comes to the story of Rip Van Winkle, Jews did it first. This past week, we just had the holiday of Purim, which is recounted in the book of Esther in the Bible. So it's a short book. If you don't know the story, go read it. The basic outline of the story is there's a Jewish queen, and nobody knows that she's Jewish, and one of the head ministers of the king of Persia decides that he wants to kill all the Jews, and he gets permission to do this, and then through a whole series of events, the queen, who is Jewish, tells the king that she's Jewish, and these are my people that are going to be killed, and everything gets turned around, and this evil minister, whose name is Haman, he gets killed, and everything that he has gets transferred over to Esther and her uncle Mordecai, and so everything is good, and the Jews survive, and now we have a whole holiday called Purim, which is the basic outline of every Jewish holiday. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat, and in this case, drink as well. But I want to talk about something, two things really. One is that the name of God is mysteriously missing in this book of the Bible, which is strange because it's probably the most common word in the entire Bible is God's name in one form or another, mentioned thousands upon thousands of times. We're talking like 6,000 times or something. No, sorry, actually, it's closer. It's almost 10,000 times. The name of God is mentioned in some form, whether it's Elohim or the Tetragrammaton, Yud Hey Vav and Hey. In some way, shape, or form, God's name is mentioned almost 10,000 times. But here in the entire book of Esther, 10 whole chapters, and there's not one mention of it whatsoever. And there are different reasons that are given for this. One of is that, because it was translated, because it was put in, it was in Aramaic, it was Persian, and it was circulated around the Persian Empire. It it was a common practice of some cultures that they would replace, if you had in your literature the name of your god, so they would replace it with the name of their gods, through the censorship and stuff like this. And they didn't want that to happen, so they left that. That's one explanation, and there's others as well. But on a deeper level, a more spiritual level, it actually hints at a much greater type of miracle. The whole Purim story is a miraculous story, and it's not a miracle like the splitting of the sea. It's not a miracle like the 10 plagues. It's not a miracle like the stopping of the sun. We're not talking completely suspending the rules of nature or breaking the rules of nature. In fact, it's just the opposite. In the book of Esther, God is using nature. The entire miracle happens within the bounds and the confines of nature itself. And the lesson to us is really to see how the regular happenings of nature are the way that God operates on a daily basis. That is miraculous. They say the only difference between nature and miracles is frequency. With nature, it happens every day. The sun rises and sets every day. The moon goes around the earth. Everything happens. The seasons, plants grow and die, and people are born. All of these things are natural occurrences. And because they happen so often and without fail, more or less, we don't recognize the divinity that's within them. And the book of Esther teaches us, while something might seem completely innocuous or even random or natural, nevertheless, this is the divine hand working in our life. And another point about the book of Esther, which I think is very apropos to right now with all of this coronavirus scare, is that in an instant, everything turns over. Literally within a matter of weeks, really within a day. In one day, the Jews are sitting in sackcloth and ashes and praying and crying because they're scared for their lives. And the next day, as it says, the words of the Megillah are nahapechu, everything's completely turned around, completely turned over. Just like we had with coronavirus, where one day everything's fine, everything's going well, and then boom, all of a sudden, schools are closing, businesses are closing, people are having trouble, stores can't keep things on the shelves, and it's very frightening for a lot of people, and there's a lot of panic out there, which I don't think is very helpful. We should never panic. We should never have hysteria. And you see that in Nahapechu, and just the opposite. You see Nahapechu, you can see it coming out the other end. We will see that just like that, everything will be back to normal. And it could be literally in an instant. Just like one day we were fine, the next day, all of a sudden, all of this mass chaos. Likewise, we can see just the opposite. Everyone's scared, everyone's running around, everyone's hoarding toilet paper, and we'll see nahapechu. We'll see that everything will turn around, and I think it will be relatively quickly. That's my, I'm not a prophet, but I think, look, we had a few years ago the H1N1 virus, and thousands of people died from that. And with this, I think right now we're at 60-something deaths in the United States, obviously many more worldwide. But compared to the number of infected, I think we're doing pretty well. And I think that while we seem to have taken a few weeks to kind of get the ball rolling in the U.S., things are pretty much are getting handled on a fairly decent basis. And I think we'll see how everything will get turned around for the good, and hopefully it'll be with the coming of Mashiach, a righteous Redeemer. So thank you so much for listening, and please, like I said, donate at jewishoswego.org/Jews did it first, and please tell your friends about the podcast. And also, I would love to learn one-on-one with people or in small groups, maybe through Facebook or whatever. So please contact me, email me, and maybe we could set up a time, especially with this self-quarantine or social distancing. People have a little more time on their hands, perhaps, and we could use that time for good to make a positive impact on ourselves, which will in turn have a positive impact on the world. Thank you so much. Have a great week.